I also have I've managed a dog boarding and training facility here in Broomfield, Colorado, using positive reinforcement, and we specialize in dogs with fear and aggression. And so when I started off my zookeeper career, I was seeing a very big difference in how we treated all these other animals versus horses. And so that's what got my interest and how I started off pursuing and learning about this type of method of working with horses. All right, so why positive reinforcement? Again, you're going to see pictures of not just horses, but also animals I've worked with that utilize positive reinforcement. All the behaviors you're seeing in these pictures are done through this method. So why positive reinforcement? It creates trust. By giving your horse that ability to say yes or no to a session, builds that trust. And what that does is build a trust account. And this is a pretty basic idea, but it goes a long way. So you're putting money, basically money into a trust account. So say you have to go halter your horse and they don't want to, and you have to corner them and just do it. That's taking out of your trust account. Same thing if you have to do an emergency farrier visit and you have to grab them and you have to grab that foot and really restrain them, that's taking out of your account. The idea is that your horse is going, or any animal is going to want to work with you more the higher that trust account is. So every time you allow your animal to have more choice, you're putting money into that trust account. So that's the basic idea of that. Also, I'm going to be throwing a lot of information at you. So again, if you have any questions at the end, I'm happy to answer those. Even after the end, I'm happy to talk more. It also builds confidence and resiliency. So for example, I had a horse and usually he was scared of mailboxes. So instead of me pulling on him and forcing him, and instead of him learning to avoid the pull by moving forward and getting closer to a mailbox, I actually taught him to target a mailbox. So he would touch his nose to it and get a treat. So instead of it being this scary object, it became a really fun thing for him to do. Where out on trails, I could point to pretty much any object and he would start touching it with his nose. And so it builds that confidence, that resiliency that they're making that choice and it's their choice and they're interactive as part of this. You're also giving that two-way communication, which I know for horses can be kind of scary to think about. And that's kind of what turns people off of this method. But your horse can't say yes if they can't, or they can't say yes if they can't say no, if that makes sense. And so you want to give them that ability, because if you keep giving them that resistance, again, if we use the example of pulling on a lead rope to get them to move forward, that could turn into a bigger behavior and a more negative behavior for them, which will go into the side effects of punishment. But if you teach them to say yes, again, they're going to choose to do that because it's fun. They get good things from it. There's no reason for them to say no. And again, that two-way communication gives choice and control in the animal, which does not mean they can do whatever they want. I worked with horses and there were times I let out their frustration. It did not mean they could kick at me every single time. There was a point I had to step in and figure out why they were kicking in this situation. And I would use minimal punishers. But again, I'll go into what that could look like instead of jumping to using a lunge whip and whipping the ground. There are very little steps I could take instead, and then reinforce them later on for doing the behavior I wanted. So it does encourage that active participation, like I've been saying. It also allows horses to express how they're feeling, which sounds kind of hippy-dippy. But if you listen to your horse and you go into a session and they're showing really positive body language and they're moving towards you, then that shows they're ready to participate. Versus if you have a horse who's walking away and not interested and you let them do that, you won't have to deal with a frustrated horse. You won't have to deal with that frustration. Because if you allow them to express that they don't want to participate in that moment, then let them and come back. So for example, my horse, I taught him to actually turn his head away. So when I adopted him, we would go into a round pen and he would pace and he would kick out at me and show he was extremely frustrated, not wanting to be a part of it. So what I did, as soon as he would turn his head, I'd walk away as quick as I could and as far as I could. And then that turned into, he could turn his head to the side, I'd move a step away or stop what I was doing. And when he was ready to go, he'd turn back to me and we'd be good to go. There's nothing negative about that interaction. So that's what I mean about expressing how they're feeling. And then this is a quote from an article, which again, we'll go into a couple of these terms later on. But careful antecedent arrangement and positive reinforcement, which is creating an environment where the animal approaches consequences rather than avoids them, should always be our first choice among training strategies. With positive reinforcement, the animal learns what to do rather than what not to do. And unlike negative reinforcement, punishment has no negative side effects. So just a nice summary. And again, at the end, I'll have a bunch of references to where you can find all the articles I mentioned in this. All right. So this is something really basic. And again, I wanted to give y'all an overview of behavior in general, so you know what positive reinforcement does and why you do it, or why you choose to do something different. So positive reinforcement, the definition is adding something to the environment to increase the likelihood of that behavior occurring again. So giving a treat to a horse after they do something you want, that's positive reinforcement, one of the definitions. There are also different ways. And the best way to think about this is as a math equation. That's the way I think of it. So reinforcement means reinforcement means you want to see the behavior increase. You want to see it again. Punishment means you want to decrease the likelihood of that behavior occurring again. Positive, you're adding to the environment. Negative, you're taking away. So positive reinforcement, you can see all the definitions right there, but that's just a nice, easy way to think about what you're doing in response to a behavior and why you're doing it. So if you want to see something more or less, I just think about this quadrant, and that helps me plan out my training sessions and what I'm going to do in response to certain behaviors I see. All right, so this is where y'all can kind of practice the quadrants a little bit. I know I went over that really quickly, so if you have questions during this part, let me know. I'm gonna move this really quick. Okay, so giving a horse a treat for putting nose through halter when you want that to happen. What is that from those quadrants? Positive reinforcement, exactly.
We're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I can just go over these too. So moving away when a horse moves quicker when you want that, that's negative reinforcement. You're taking yourself away to reinforce that behavior occurring again. And that's assuming we are pretty aversive, not pretty aversive, but we're slightly aversive, since adding that space to the environment is adding a positive reaction from them, hopefully. Kicking harder when a horse doesn't move as quick as you would like, and that is positive punishment. We're adding something aversive to get the horse to do, to stop that behavior of them not moving as quickly. And most of these, this is where it gets tricky depending on the behavior you're looking at, whether you want it or not. That's how you can tell the quadrants. So it can get a little tricky. And again, this is not saying people who kick their horse to move quicker are awful human beings. This is just so we know exactly what we're doing and what is happening when we're doing it. So I want to be really clear about that. This is not bashing anyone in any way. This is just so people have a better understanding of what's happening in that moment. So whipping near a horse to get them to change direction when they aren't, that's also positive. So that's positive punishment. We're adding something to decrease them moving forward. Giving scratches when a horse stops when asked. I put this one as multiple ones because it depends if the horse enjoys it. So really, that's where you have to know your horse really well. I've worked with horses that did not enjoy it and could be seen as a punishment. I've worked with horses that love it and it is a reinforcer. So it's very dependent on the horse. And then taking wood out of a paddock to stop cribbing, that's negative punishment. This is the one a lot of people have trouble with, and I have trouble with this one too. So it's taking something out of the environment to stop that behavior from occurring again. Does that make sense to everyone? I know these are pretty basic, but I feel like it's pretty important to know these things. Cool.
I think the taking wood out of paddock to stop cribbing. Can you talk just a little bit more about that one? So we're taking something out, but to stop cribbing, which we think is bad.
Yes. So again, negative punishment is one of those that's kind of hard to use. If it's not a horse, an easier way to think about it, and this is what helps me, if there's a noise happening to get a behavior to stop, so say, now I'm even getting myself charged up. Okay, I won't go into that. So taking wood out of a paddock to stop cribbing. You're taking something out of the environment to decrease the likelihood of the behavior. Oh. So if you think about it, again, it's like a math equation. So if you break it down that way, you're like, okay, so this is where it falls in that. So I still get tripped up and I still use those quadrants quite a bit. So, so yeah, and they're all over the internet. So very easy to find. All right, so behavioral hierarchy. So when you're thinking of a training plan and where to start with positive reinforcement training, or any sort of training, this is something that was developed by Susan Friedman. I actually have her website listed at the end. She is a human psychologist who now works with a number of shelters and zoos and aquariums, and she has paved the way for positive reinforcement and empowerment in animals. So she developed this from a human psychological point of view on how we should work with humans. But it works with animals too. This is very well known in the zoo field. So basically gives you, so this yellow card here, basically you start off there. And when you're looking at a behavior, you go step by step. So you'll see the last place you should be is positive punishment. You should always start off with, sorry, my screen is here. So you should always start off making sure your horse is healthy, their nutrition's good, and that they're having the right physical setting. So making sure they're healthy and they're set up for success in the best way possible, and making sure they're the right tool for the job. That's also really important. So not having these high expectations that aren't really attainable, because that's frustrating for everyone. So once you have that figured out, you move to your antecedent arrangements. And again, if you say you want a horse to line up at a mounting block, you want to set the horse up so maybe that they walk between the fence line and the mounting block first. And that sets them up. So it's a very clear indication of where you want them to go, rather than having it in the middle of an arena. They have all this other space to go to. Instead, you have very clear criteria of where you want them to be. So making sure antecedent arrangements, and this again includes the environment, is there loud noises happening? Do you have the right food for them if you are using positive reinforcement? Do you know where their favorite scratching spot is if you are using scratches? So really think about, are you best setting yourself and your horse up for success? If the behavior isn't able to change with your antecedent arrangements, then you move to positive reinforcement. And this does involve the training aspect. And I won't go into positive reinforcement right now too much. But again, say your horse isn't understanding lining up at the mounting block just by that antecedent arrangement. That's when you go into maybe doing some target training with them and having them target their nose through it. And then you can start fading that target out. And instead the cue is when you go to the mounting block, they line up and they get something really good for it. If the behavior isn't able to work that way, then you go to differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, or a DRA. And that's where you try to think of other behaviors that you could do in that. So kind of target training goes along with that. You could also ask them to do a touch behavior. There are a number of things you could do to train this behavior without actually focusing on that mounting block behavior, if that makes sense. So you can train other behaviors along with it. I usually start off with target training or station, and that way it gives them more information. And so you could do that with that mounting block. If that doesn't work, you go to extinction, negative reinforcement, negative punishment. Extinction, I'll go into a little bit. It goes along with punishment, obviously. That also has some side effects to it. And you'll notice there's this little caution sign. So that means kind of go back and reevaluate what's been done already and make sure you haven't missed anything or there wasn't anything else you could do at either of those other steps. If that doesn't work, then you could go to positive punishment. But again, stop sign's there to make sure you reevaluated all other options. And also you want to phase that out as much as you can or as quickly as you can and go back to your antecedent arrangements and your positive reinforcement, if that makes sense. I know this is a lot of information. Again, I'm happy to stay on after and talk more about this. And what this follows, the reason for this and why it was developed, it follows LEMA. This is something big in the training world. So LEMA is least intrusive, minimally aversive. And so you'll hear LEMA quite a bit, like in the zoo world, we say it a lot. And so if you're making a training plan and don't worry about getting too caught up in this, go back to LEMA and just think as least intrusive, minimally aversive. Sometimes positive punishment is, honestly, sometimes the horse needs that information if it's the right job for them. If you've done all these other steps, you can use positive punishment in that LEMA model. But again, you want to go back and stick to that model as quick as you can. And this is another one. This is what I would do every time I train a new behavior. I think of my ABCs. This is something really easy and it's extremely helpful in my opinion. It's your antecedent behavior consequence. So again, are you setting your horse up for success in their environment? Think about what exactly the behavior is. Don't just say, I'm going to ask them to stop. Think, how quick am I going to ask them to, or how quick do I want them to stop? Is it okay if they take a few steps and then stop? Is it okay if they stop right away? What exactly behaviorally are you looking for? And then what consequence are you going to use? And again, that goes back to that quadrants. Do you want to punish that behavior or you want to reinforce? Which if you're going by LEMA, you want to try really hard to reinforce. So I know that was a lot. And again, I'll stick with y'all and I'm happy to answer all the questions. I know I'm throwing a lot at you. I just want you to have a really good groundwork of what we're doing when we're talking about positive reinforcement. All right, so here's what punishment does. And this is something from not only journals and studies, there are a lot of studies out there on punishment, not just with horses, but also with other animals. And this is also from in my dog training management, also working with horses, I've seen effects of punishment. And so there are also some things I've seen. All right, so this is an article from Dr. Susan Friedman.
Hey, Janna.
Yes.
Would it be too interruptive if we stopped and asked some of the positive reinforcement questions right now?
Oh yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, okay.
I'll go back to hierarchy.
Yeah, okay, cool. There's a few here. Okay, so the first one popped up and said, are stallions and mares more opinionated than geldings because of hormones?
Yes, in my experience, but what you also have to make sure is that behavior is behavior. And so also making sure your horse is the right tool for the job and you're not asking too much. If you have a stallion, you want them to walk in a round pen where they're used to maybe running around and getting energy out, it might take some more work to do that. You might have to set up some more antecedent arrangements. You might have to have really strong reinforcers. You might have to do some more basic training, maybe a station or a target, so you can get them thinking and moving in a different way. So yes, those animals can be, especially mares when they're in heat. I do have experience with that, and yes, their behavior does change. I'm partial to geldings for that reason. But again, it's all looking at behavior. Something to be aware of is your animal and their individual behavior, their genetic behavior, and their instincts. And so I like to talk about labeling, but in those instances, I think it's more so being aware. So that's a really good question. Did I answer that? Answer that pretty well? Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. And that makes total sense. So as you know, because I think you're familiar with adopting a horse.
Mhm.
They come with learned behaviors, and one of these questions states that um, the horse was trained with treats. So eventually they want to phase that behavior out. So what is the best way to phase treats out as the positive reinforcer, and see if there's any others?
So I would say if you, again, it's all situational. I love using treats. So it's kind of a more difficult question for me to answer. But I understand why some people don't want to use treats. Either the horse can guard it or it's inconvenient. What I would say is find what else is motivating. See if there's a special spot on them that they really enjoy being scratched on, and use that for telling them, yes, you did it. That's what the treats are for. It's telling them in a moment, yes, you did exactly what I want. This good thing is coming. I worked with a horse that he couldn't have treats. And so I did have to, I was scratching all over his body trying to find a spot that he behaviorally showed he enjoyed. So I'd say that's your best bet, is trying to find that. You want to find some way to say yes. If you have to use pressure, again, make sure your timing is on point. And I know I've had to practice when I've really had to time my release of pressure. So if you're riding, you can definitely use negative reinforcement. It just has to be really spot on in order to communicate it for that specific behavior. So I'd say those are probably your best bets.
Okay. How would you, I was thinking about the quadrant. This is one of my questions. How would you train away a horse that strikes out?
Yeah, so this is something I didn't add in here. So you want to think of why that's happening first off. There is a function for every behavior. So the first thing to do is figure out what's the function behind the behavior. If it's an aggressive behavior, like if it's over food or anything in particular, or if it's just a certain area he tends to do this at. I've worked with horses that were fearful. And so what I did is something called counter conditioning. It's a little bit more difficult in horses, but basically it's to help change the emotion behind the behavior. So instead of them seeing a stimulus, like say if it's a person or a specific area, give them hay in that area while that stimulus is around. If that makes sense. And you can protect yourself and be protected contact. So like with so my friends adopted a baby Mustang, and so she would turn her butt and kick out. And so what I did with her, not necessarily counter conditioning, but at first what I would do with her is I would just throw hay to her and just hang out. And so that made me a positive thing. I'd also she didn't know how to take treats, so that was harder, but you can like put food, like treats in a hay bucket and make that even more fun. But I would do, as soon as I started seeing that little behavior of her even turning her head to do that behavior, I would leave. And then once I saw her behavior settle down and she was in a more calm state, then I went in and restarted the session. If it consistently happened, like if every time I went in there, she did it immediately, then I'd go back to counter conditioning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so kind of replacing, I kind of thought about it as replacing the negative feeling or, behind that behavior with something positive.
Right. And over time, what counter conditioning does, and again, training we were talking about good training takes a long time. It's not overnight. Counter conditioning definitely takes a long time. But what you'll get is a horse that feels confident and feels positive about the interaction. So then once they get that, it goes pretty quickly. But that initial counter conditioning, it's pairing something negative with something positive. And so over time, that negative emotion will turn positive because they're like, oh, that is a good thing. And once you start noticing that they look at you and then look for food, then you can phase it out, because then that turns into the more like a trained behavior rather than a natural behavior.
Yeah. And one other question I had too is there's concern about horses becoming mouthy
Mhm.
when you do the treats, when you do a lot of the positive reinforcement.
Sure.
How can you mitigate that issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've actually worked with a horse that he took treats really hard. And so for safety reasons, we don't hand feed him. So what we'll do is either throw food on the ground for him or feed him out of a bucket. And so our hands aren't involved in it at all. What I used to do for my horse is sometimes I would just give him hay in a hay bag in between sessions to let him know we were on a break, or even just a handful of hay so you can keep your hands out of it. Again, if it's a horse that has food resource guarding, that goes back into counter conditioning. And again, if you have a horse that does that or interested in that, that's a little bit more complicated. I'm happy to go into that. But from my experience with horses that, especially if they're new to it, they learn pretty quickly. They don't need to have that aggression because, again, you're giving them food. A lot of times when horses bite really hard, it's out of frustration. The new little Mustang baby, she definitely was trying to figure out food. So we were feeding her out of a bucket. And when she's frustrated, she will bite harder. But that's why I always start off with a bucket first. I'd never hand feed horses right off the bat. I really get to know them and what makes them bite harder so I can be aware of that and work with them through that, because that's also an indication they're uncomfortable. So I would recommend, if you're starting treat training with a horse, use a bucket. I use like the black rubber tubs because they're really nice and flat, but whatever works for you. So yeah. Does that
Okay,
answer
so
that?
yeah, so I think you alluded to just separating the hand means food, right?
Yes. And what you do, so here's what I do with training. I should have added this on the PowerPoint, but I didn't. So the basics of training a behavior is you have the behavior, you have a marker or a bridge, and then you reinforce. So they learn they only get food when that bridge occurs. And a bridge could be anything. It could be the word, I use the word good. The horses know when I'm in a session and I say it a certain way rather than just talking to a friend and like, I had a good day. They don't run over and try to eat anything. You can use, I know some people like use a clicker. You can use a clicker, you can use a whistle. Sometimes those can kind of scary for horses. So that's why I just use a verbal. You can do a click with your mouth. But then they learn they only get food when that happens. And that's the power of a marker. So you can even do that, like the question before, if you don't want to use food, you can do that with a release. You can add a bridge to anything. You just want something really clear to tell them, you did this, and that's what a marker is for. And then something good is coming. Okay. So you can definitely shape it to where you use that marker and get them really used to it. And again, if y'all want to learn how to do that, I'm happy to teach you how. It's really easy. Horses catch on real quick to it. But yeah, that's definitely a really good tool to use. So they learn not every time they see you, they're getting food.
Yeah. Okay. That makes total sense. Thank
Cool.
you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
I think that was the last one. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. So, what does punishment do? And again, I want to reiterate, this is not to bash any type of training. This is scientific evidence of what happens when punishment is used. Again, I've used it. Currently, I use it very minimally, but I do use it. It's about being aware of what you're doing and why you want to switch it to positive reinforcement. So I'll let you all read this. It's kind of a long paragraph. But again, scientists have been studying this. There's so many articles out there, especially now as we're getting more technology to actually look at facial expressions on animals and body language really, really closely. So these are just some things. So aggression can occur because you're not letting them say no. And so if they're trying to tell you, no, I'm scared of this, no, I'm scared of this, we've all had that happen, or maybe not. I've had it happen When I used to use more punishment, I'd be pulling on them to try to get them to come closer to an object they were scared of. They would pull back. Sometimes they would rear. Sometimes they would run. Sometimes they would kick out. And so that's that aggression. And the problem with aggression, it's aggression. But another thing, if you try to wait it out and try to ignore it and just keep doing it, something is going to occur called an extinction burst. And if you've had a puppy, you've experienced this. So it happens, what it means is the behavior is going to get bigger and bigger to see how much effort they need to put in to say no, and then it goes away. But there's going to be that increased aggression or whatever the behavior is, you're going to get that increased behavior during that extinction burst. So I say puppies because it happens when we crate train our puppies for the first time. And they cry louder, they cry louder, they cry louder, and even more. And that's the really hard part to wait through. It's the same thing with any behavior using that extinction burst. So if you're using punishment, and that's why horses keep getting more and more bigger, and that's where people can get hurt. So that is a side effect. Avoidance, where if you go out to the pasture and they just walk away because they now know what the halter means or what this one person means. So you'll see that. It's other instances of avoidance. That's what we use the lunge whip for and a lot of other things, because they want to avoid what they're doing or what that object is. Learned helplessness is a really big one. I've seen this in a lot of horses. It's kind of, until you know it, it's hard to see. Because it looks like the most perfect horse you'll ever see. But what it is, it's actually a shutdown animal. So basically they've learned there's no escape from the stimulus they're trying to get away from. They have no choice, and so they just kind of shut down. So there's a study done by, I believe it was B.F. Skinner, who's a famous behavioral psychologist. He developed this term because what he did was put dogs in a room, different dogs at individual times, and the whole floor was on a shock. And so I know it's terrible. It was way back in the day when ethics weren't a thing. But anyway, so they shocked the whole floor, and the dogs eventually just laid down. And that's learned helplessness, where they just give up. And again, in horses, it might not look like it because they're doing what you want, but what you're going to see is a horse that doesn't really have much personality, like trail horses. Trail horses are a really great example, or like not all trail horses, but you know, we've gone on those really popular trails where a lot of people ride them, a lot of different experiences, so they have to be really safe and good. And that's learned helplessness, where horses just basically asleep and doing what they need to do. So that's a side effect. Here's a couple more. This is from a scientific study from a veterinary behavior article. Punishment is associated with certain emotional states, such as fear and frustration, the punished animal, and has been shown to decrease learning in horses. Frustration enhances attempts at restoring instrumental control over available reinforcers. Freud also reported that although certain amounts of fear and frustration may actually enhance learning, high levels tend to depress it and may contribute to pathologic emotional states. And so basically what that means, again, like I was saying, positive punishment can be used, especially horses. They are prey animals and go off of pressure. So sometimes that is, again, LEMA, least intrusive, minimally aversive. But again, if you use too much of it or too high, that's when these side effects start happening. So again, you're suppressing, but not enhancing alternative behaviors. So again, they're just kind of putting down punishment has the potential to desensitize an animal to the punishing stimulus. Sorry, this is a typo. If the punishing intensity is not optimal. So again, they can get desensed. So if you're using too little, they can totally get desensed to whatever you're trying to use. So again, you want to know your horse really well and the behavior, and know yourself too, and make sure it's the right fit for everyone of what kind of punishment you're using to best communicate and set everyone up for success. Punishment carries the risk of emotional changes that can interfere with attention and learning. So again, that shutdown state or getting too high frustration levels and aggression levels. It can also be associated by the animal with the person delivering it. So again, sometimes horses will see a person coming towards them in a field, and they might run away. And it happens every time. That's because they've generalized that punishment behavior to a person or a thing, which could be the halter sometimes. Same thing, that's where aggression towards people usually comes from, is there was some sort of punishment history, and that's how they've learned they can get away from people. So they've just associated that one behavior. It could have even happened one time. Some horses are extremely sensitive and they just associate that one experience with people. Makes sense? All right. So what I want you to take away from today is, again, this is about positive reinforcement. I love positive reinforcement, but I really want y'all to get a really good understanding of behavior and what each quadrant does. So understand the quadrant you're using. So natural horsemanship, although some do use positive reinforcement in it, it usually uses negative reinforcement, positive punishment. Again, it's not the worst thing. I'm not trying to bash it. It's just being aware of what is happening. Think of your ABCs in the behavioral hierarchy when you're training. Also Lima, and have a clear goal of what behavior you are looking for. If y'all want an example of training plans, I have my email at the end of this, so feel free to reach out and I'm happy to send you examples. It seems really corny, but at the barn I help at, each animal has a training log, and that's where we can write down training plans too. Also, if you have multiple people working the same horse, that's extremely helpful. So yeah, so that's it. Questions, thoughts, concerns?
We didn't have too many additional questions come in the chat. I did have a question back in the day. I had a smaller pony, and it wasn't all the time, but once in a while when I would tie her to the pole in the barn, or sometimes even the side of the trailer when we were somewhere, either at the farm, maybe on a trail, she would fly back and pull and pull and pull. I mean, it was the scariest thing. And it literally has traumatized me since a young child. And I just would stand back and watch, and then she would just stop and stand up like nothing happened. And so,
right.
What do you do?
So what I would do in that case is, so I actually had to do something with my rescue horse very similar. And again, this is the really frustrating part of training, is getting that really solid groundwork and getting that emotional well-being really high, and then building upon that. And so when I had my horse, he, like I said, would go in the round pen and pace and just really show he was extremely uncomfortable. Yeah, so what I did leading up to the round pen, and we had to start way back, and what I geared it was by his behavior. There was a point we got too close and he would start tensing up and his head would get high. So what I did was take a step back from the round pen and literally just sat with him while he ate hay on the ground in the hay bag until he was showing he was comfortable. And then we move a step forward, and then we do the same thing until we could go on the round pen and he could get so much food in there. And that's all we did for a while. We just started helping him feel comfortable in that area. So what I do with that situation where there's something about the trailer that's uncomfortable, I would start off just walking them up, seeing what their threshold is where they start showing they're uncomfortable. Take a step back and give them, I use hay in a bag because then at least it takes them a while and you can easily pick it up and move it. Mm-hmm. And just watch for their behavior. What you want to see is a conditioned emotional response, and that can be positive or negative. So what you want to see is when they see that stimulus, they don't show a negative one by tensing up and showing behaviors that they're alarmed or frustrated or anything like that. You want to see them be nice and calm. And that happens while there's something good around, and usually that's food. So I would do that, and then if you do that and they're still uncomfortable, like keep taking steps back and maybe look at, is it the trailer itself? Is it the truck? Is it something in the environment? So really sitting down, looking at all the antecedents that happen, think of the behavior, and then think of the consequence. Again, those ABCs.
Okay.
But counter conditioning is the best way to go for any fearful or aggressive animal.
Yeah, just make it the positive environment. That makes total sense.
Again, it's not the funnest thing ever. Counter conditioning is like watching glue dry. Like it is so boring. But once your horse feels comfortable, you can build upon that and you have a really solid behavior. I'm really bad at technology. I was gonna post videos, but I had a horse when I adopted him. He was scared of everything. He hadn't been ridden, terrified of people, didn't even know how to take treats. So since I started riding him, he had never bucked, he had never reared, he never spooked. I took him on mountain trails and he led the trails. And that's because I helped him for about the first 8 months or so. We just did counter conditioning. It was so boring, but it really paid off.
Okay, and that's a great segue into a question that we had come in here. It says, how much does groundwork transfer into riding? Is it important to have that ground that ground relationship before trying to accomplish something in the saddle?
Yes. Yes. So groundwork, I think, is one of the most important things you could do with a horse, because you're teaching skills that can definitely transfer. And so what I did whenever I work with a horse, I always train vocal cues I'm going to use in the saddle on the ground. If that makes sense. And I also train them vocal cues for moving forward. And I don't put the saddle on until they start understanding those. So that way, when I get in the saddle for the first time, they're not wondering what to do. Like, what's this pressure on my side? What is happening? What direction do I go? They know it because I laid that groundwork. So I taught them how to move up a gate, how to stop. I even teach them how to turn on the ground. I have a hand target that I teach all the horses. I don't rely on that as much because I do a lot of work with the bridle and getting them used to turning to pressure. But again, I ask them to move and I give them a treat for it. So again, it's a really positive, fun thing. And also, so when I get that saddle on, I train them to move towards me or station. I never have them tied up when I saddle because that's a really clear indication to me of how they're feeling about it. But what I do, so usually the first time I put a saddle pad on, I just work with that. And I give them treats every time they come towards me with it at first or they touch it. And then I start moving it on them. They get treats for that. If they move away, they move away, but nothing happens. They don't get good stuff. They don't get bad stuff. Just, it's pretty boring for them. So when I've done this, the horses always come back and we repeat the process until they're very comfortably standing there. They know it's time to saddle up. They'll just walk over and stand there, no tie. And then when I get on there, because they feel comfortable with everything already, they're not forced to wear it. It's not scary. They're pretty comfortable with me getting on them. And because they already know those cues I've taught them, it's pretty easy. And another big thing I do with horses is I give them breaks. So the first time I work with getting on a horse, I don't just stand there for 30 minutes working on that. Especially that's pretty high stress for them the first time. So I usually just put my foot in and get them used to that, maybe 5 minutes, and then I give them a break. And then I come back and repeat that until they're really comfortable and we can progress. But breaks seem to really help also for you because it's also really stressful. I don't know about y'all, some training sessions really get to me. And so for me to also take a break is really helpful. And so I'm a really big proponent of breaks. And usually what I do is I give them hay in a hay bag and they can graze and do whatever. But it's also a really positive thing for them to have those breaks. But yes, groundwork definitely transfers in my experience. I find it extremely helpful. And that's why I think I've had really good luck saddle training horses because we have laid that really important groundwork. And then when I get on, it's pretty smooth and easy.
Awesome. That makes total sense. That was a great question.
That was an awesome question.
Thank you for answering that.
Yeah.
That looks like the last question that has come in. I appreciate your time so much, Janna.
Yes.
This was very exciting, and I think the work that you do and how successful it has been with your own horse, like you were saying, is just unbelievable. That's heartwarming, and it gives, us an additional resource out there in case, we're having issues with our own ponies at any time that we need some help with.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you so much for attending this and letting me talk about this. I'm very passionate about it, and it's really great to know people are open to learning more about this and trying it. I did leave all my information here, so if you guys ever have questions or just want to chat, I'm always open for discussion about this as well. Um, but yeah, if you ever are like, I want to train this and not sure how, right now, just I really want to help people understand more, and I love connecting with other people. So feel free to jot my email down and reach out to me. I also have my website. I don't know if y'all are on Instagram. I'm sorry I couldn't get videos, but I do post. I haven't posted as much, but I do have a bunch of videos of what this looks like, as well as some tips. So feel free to check out my Instagram and you can see what this actually could look like. And this is also Mustang Whiskey Ranch is another business I'm in, which is about rescuing and rehabbing Mustangs. If you're also interested in learning more about this, I highly recommend checking out behaviorworks.org. That's Dr. Susan Friedman's site. A lot of it is about parrots, but it's still behavior is behavior and training is training. So for the most part, it's a really great source for learning more about that.
Great. I think that's it then.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, got a little hand clap.
oh, thank you. Well, thank you all so much. This is a big passion of mine. So I'm very excited to be able to share this with you. So, and again, feel free to reach out anytime.
Thank you so much, Janna.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Y'all have a great night and hope to talk to y'all in the future.
Yeah, you too. Bye, everybody. Thank you for
Bye.
coming.
You're welcome. Just gonna reach out. Sorry. I just saw Linda left a note. Oh, she left.